Tonight, we're stepping into a medieval tavern as it actually functioned, not as a place of noise or spectacle, but as a carefully managed space where light, fire, drink, food, and people were handled in predictable, repeatable ways. Taverns were not chaotic rooms that came alive at night. They were opened deliberately, prepared methodically, and closed with the same attention every single day. In this video, we'll move slowly through an ordinary evening, beginning outside as the light fades, then following the practical systems that keep the tavern running, from ale storage and serving, to heat management, cleaning, payment, and quiet social order. There are no heroes here, no dramatic moments, only routines that worked well enough to be repeated for centuries. You don't need to stay fully awake to follow along. Everything is explained clearly, at a steady pace, so you can either listen closely or let the structure of the evening carry you into rest. We'll begin before the doors open, as people start to arrive from the road and the fire inside is being set for the night. Taverns begin to matter at the point in the day when movement stops being efficient, which is why people approach them before darkness rather than after it. Travel in medieval towns and along connecting roads depends almost entirely on usable daylight, because surfaces are uneven, drainage is poor, and ruts, stones, and standing water become difficult to judge once the sun drops low. Carts risk damaged wheels or axles. Animals slow or stumble, and anyone walking with tools or loads expends more effort for less progress. Burning torches to compensate is costly in fuel and provides narrow, unreliable light, so most people plan to end their movement while they can still see the ground clearly. For this reason, taverns are placed where daily movement naturally compresses, most often near town gates, market edges, bridges, or along the primary road that carries people in and out. These locations intercept laborers returning from fields, craftsmen leaving workshops, and travelers reaching a practical stopping point without requiring detours or additional effort. The tavern does not pull people toward it. It receives them at the moment when continuing forward no longer makes sense. The building itself is not designed to stand out. Construction follows local norms, timber-framed or stone-built depending on region, with low roofs and thick walls intended to conserve heat and resist wear. Identification relies on simple markers that can be recognized quickly. A hanging sign shows an image rather than words, because literacy cannot be assumed and recognition must be immediate. The image is chosen for clarity rather than decoration. A tankard, an animal, a crown, or a common tool, something that can be remembered after a single glance. In some areas, a pole or bundle of greenery near the door indicates that ale is available, a long-standing practice tied to regulation and custom rather than aesthetics. As daylight fades, the most reliable signal that the tavern will open is the presence of fire inside. Light becomes visible through small upper windows or gaps in shutters, not because the interior is bright, but because the hearth must already be maintained for cooking and warmth. Openings are kept narrow to limit heat loss and smoke movement, so the light seen from outside is uneven and subdued, but sufficient to confirm that fuel is available and the fire is stable. People approaching are not discovering the tavern for the first time. They are confirming that it is functioning as expected. Local residents tend to arrive first. Their work ends with daylight rather than a measured hour, so arrival times vary slightly, producing small numbers rather than a coordinated group. They approach alone or in pairs, carrying the visible residue of labor, mud on boots, dust on clothing, tools set down for the evening, Carts are drawn aside to keep the road clear, animals are tied to familiar posts or rails, and loads are adjusted or secured. Actions repeated daily and requiring no instruction. During this period, doors often remain closed while interior tasks are finished, because opening too early consumes light and fuel without enough people present to justify it. Travelers arrive under different constraints. Their decision to stop is based on distance already covered and light remaining, not on local routine. Once visibility drops below a usable level, continuing forward increases the risk of injury, loss, or mechanical failure, so many stop earlier than planned. For them, the tavern provides shelter, drink, and often sleeping space, and arrival marks the end of movement rather than a pause. They wait alongside locals without priority, because service follows availability and sequence rather than urgency. While people wait outside, the space does not become crowded or noisy. Some stand to keep warm as the air cools, others lean against the wall to rest, and conversation remains brief because most are still transitioning out of work rather than into leisure. The smell of smoke from inside carries practical information, indicating that the hearth has been kept throughout the day and that fuel remains sufficient for the evening. A tavern without a stable fire cannot heat the room, cook food, or keep ale from chilling, so this detail matters. Inside, preparation reaches its final stage before anyone is admitted. The hearth has been checked, so embers can be brought back to flame without excessive fuel. Benches and trestle tables are set where they will remain for the night to avoid unnecessary movement, and rushes, or straw, are spread in areas where spills are most likely to occur. Ale barrels are already positioned near the serving area, because moving full casks later requires multiple people and interrupts service. Cups are rinsed and stacked or hung for reuse, not polished, because cleanliness is maintained through constant turnover rather than finish. The decision to open is made by observation rather than schedule. The tavern keeper weighs remaining daylight, the number of people waiting, and the state of the fire, because opening too early wastes heat and light, while opening too late disrupts the expected flow of the evening. This judgment is learned through repetition and adjusted by season as daylight length changes. When the bar is finally lifted and the door unlatched, people enter without haste, expecting the interior to be arranged as it was the night before. With the last usable daylight fading outside, the tavern becomes the primary space equipped to manage fire safely and continuously. Arrival gives way to the next task, opening the room itself, securing the shutters, arranging the benches, and preparing the space for steady use, which is where the evening's work inside the tavern properly begins. Opening the tavern is a controlled transition from a closed, heat-holding building into a working interior, and it is done in a deliberate order because every early mistake multiplies later in the evening. The first task is releasing the door from its bar or latch, not to open it wide, but to allow measured entry. Keeping the door mostly closed preserves the warmth already held in the walls and floor and limits sudden drafts that would pull smoke back from the hearth. In colder seasons especially, opening too fully at the start forces the fire to work harder than necessary, increasing fuel use before any drink or food has been served. Shutters are addressed next because they regulate both light and airflow. If any daylight remains, shutters are opened only enough to admit it where it is useful, usually near the serving area or hearth. Full opening is avoided since the benefit of light is brief and the cost in heat loss is immediate. Shutters also control how smoke behaves once the fire is brought up, and small adjustments can determine whether the room stays usable or fills with irritation and haze. These decisions are not aesthetic. They are based on long familiarity with how this specific building responds to air movement. With access and airflow controlled, attention shifts to the furniture, which defines how people will move once the room fills. Benches are carried or dragged into their established positions, most often along walls or paired with long trestle tables, because fixed arrangements reduce congestion and limit unnecessary walking. There is no attempt to optimize comfort beyond what is required to sit and drink. Benches are solid, narrow, and backless in many taverns, encouraging people to sit upright and leave when finished, rather than linger indefinitely. Trestle tables are checked for level, wedges added under legs where floors dip, because a shifting table wastes drink, creates mess, and draws attention away from service. The floor is prepared alongside the furniture, not afterward, because once people are inside, access becomes limited. Rushes, straw, or chaff are spread where traffic will be heaviest, particularly near benches, tables, and the serving area. These materials serve as the tavern's primary method of managing spills, mud, and moisture tracked in from outside. They absorb ale, reduce slipping, and provide a thin barrier against cold stone or packed earth floors. Old material is not completely removed unless it has become unusable, because replacing it requires cutting, drying, and transport. Instead, fresh layers are added where needed, creating a surface that is functional rather than clean in a modern sense. Only after the space is physically arranged does the hearth receive full attention, because it supports every other activity. Embers from earlier in the day are stirred gently to test whether they can be revived without excessive fuel. If embers are weak, small pieces of dry wood are added first, not large logs, to re-establish flame efficiently. The draw of the hearth is checked by observing how smoke moves once flame appears. Poor ventilation makes the room difficult to use and unhealthy to occupy, so adjustments to vents or flues are made early, before the room fills and changes become disruptive. Lighting is introduced only after the hearth is stable. Candles and rushlights are valuable consumables, and they are lit according to need rather than appearance. The first lights are placed near the hearth and serving area, where work requires clear visibility to avoid burns, spills, and accidents. The rest of the room remains dim until people begin to occupy it, at which point additional lights are added gradually. This staged approach ensures that fuel for lighting lasts through the evening, and that no flame burns unattended or without purpose. Fuel planning happens continuously during this process, not as a separate calculation. The tavern keeper assesses the amount of wood on hand, the expected number of patrons, and the likelihood that cooking will be required. Wood is staged within reach of the hearth but not fed continuously, allowing the fire to be increased or reduced in response to conditions inside the room. Burning too hot early wastes fuel and dries the space unnecessarily, while burning too low delays food preparation and reduces comfort. Managing this balance is a learned skill, adjusted daily and seasonally. Throughout the opening sequence, time is measured by observable conditions rather than by any external schedule. The door is opened wider when enough people are waiting to justify heat loss. Additional lights are lit when movement increases. More fuel is added when the room cools or cooking begins. Each decision responds to what is visible, audible, or felt, rather than to a predetermined hour. This allows the tavern to function efficiently without clocks, written plans, or fixed opening times. By the time the first cups are drawn, the space has fully shifted from storage and preparation to active use. Benches and tables are fixed in place. The floor is ready to absorb what will fall onto it. The hearth burns steadily, and light is sufficient for work without excess. Nothing has been arranged for display or comfort alone. Every choice has been made to limit waste, conserve fuel, and reduce unnecessary movement. Because once service begins, the space must support hours of steady use without interruption. Ale sits at the center of the tavern's operation because it solves several problems at once, providing calories, hydration, and a product that can be produced locally with predictable tools and materials. Water alone is unreliable in many towns, often contaminated by runoff, waste, or stagnant sources, and boiling it daily for safe consumption requires fuel that is better reserved for cooking and heat. Ale, by contrast, begins with boiling as part of its production, and the fermentation process makes it safer to drink than untreated water. For this reason, ale is not a luxury or a pastime, but a staple, consumed by adults and children alike in varying strengths depending on age, labor, and availability. Most taverns do not brew on-site every day, but they are tightly connected to brewing schedules, whether through in-house production, nearby household brewers, or small commercial operations. Brewing is typically done in batches that align with the capacity of available vessels and the expected rate of consumption, because ale has a limited lifespan once fermentation begins. Unlike later hopped beers, medieval ale spoils quickly, especially in warm conditions, so production is timed to ensure that drinkable ale is always available without allowing large quantities to turn sour. This timing governs much of the tavern's rhythm, even when brewing happens elsewhere. Not all ale served in the tavern is the same. Weak ale, often called small ale or small beer, is produced from later runnings of the mash, containing less fermentable sugar and therefore less alcohol. This ale is thin, lightly fermented, and intended for regular consumption throughout the day, including by laborers who need hydration and calories without impairment. Stronger ale comes from the first runnings, where more sugars are extracted, resulting in higher alcohol content and a richer body. These stronger batches are produced less frequently and consumed more deliberately, because they spoil just as easily but require more grain to make. The distinction between weak and strong ale is not primarily about preference, but about resource management. Grain is valuable, and using it efficiently means extracting multiple batches from the same mash. Weak ale stretches supplies and provides a baseline drink that can be consumed steadily, while stronger ale is reserved for evenings, guests with means, or moments when higher caloric intake is desirable. Taverns must balance these types carefully, because serving too much strong ale increases intoxication and disorder, while relying solely on weak ale may reduce appeal and revenue. Once brewed, ale is transferred into barrels for storage and transport. Barrels are made of wood staves bound by hoops, and their quality directly affects how long ale will keep. Poorly fitted staves allow air ingress, accelerating spoilage, while well-made barrels slow but do not stop it. Ale is stored in cool areas whenever possible, often cellars or shaded rooms, because heat speeds fermentation beyond the desired point. Taverns are acutely aware of temperature, not as an abstract concern, but because warm ale turns sour faster and loses value. Barrels are positioned with intention. They are heavy when full and difficult to move once tapped, so they are set near serving areas before opening. Gravity is used instead of pumps, with barrels placed on stands or trestles so liquid can flow downward into cups or pitchers. This reduces labor and limits spillage, but it also means barrels must be rotated carefully as they empty. A poorly placed barrel can become unusable halfway through the evening if flow slows or sediment is disturbed. Tapping a barrel is a deliberate act, not done until there is reasonable certainty that the contents will be consumed within a short period. Once a barrel is opened, exposure to air accelerates spoilage, so partially used barrels represent risk. Taverns therefore manage stock by opening smaller casks first or dedicating specific barrels to specific periods of the day. Weak ale may be tapped earlier and consumed steadily, while stronger ale is opened later when demand is clearer. This sequencing reduces waste and ensures drink quality remains acceptable. Taste testing is an ongoing responsibility. The tavern keeper or an experienced worker samples ale regularly, not for enjoyment, but to assess fermentation state and detect early souring. Slight changes in flavor indicate how much time remains before a batch becomes unfit for sale. Decisions are made quickly based on these assessments. Ale that is approaching spoilage may be served preferentially, priced differently, or mixed into cooking before it turns completely. Once ale becomes undrinkable, it represents a loss that cannot be recovered. Rotation logic governs which barrels are used and when. Older ale is served before newer batches, and stronger ale is monitored more closely because its higher sugar content can lead to more rapid changes once opened. Taverns keep mental records rather than written ones, tracking which casks were brewed when, how long they have been stored, and how quickly they are being consumed. This knowledge is built through repetition and experience, not formal training, and mistakes are costly enough to ensure lessons are remembered. Spoilage is not treated as a rare failure, but as an expected boundary. Ale that has turned too far cannot be saved, and no amount of explanation will convince patrons to drink it. For this reason, taverns aim to operate close to the edge of freshness, where ale is consumed near the peak of drinkability. This requires aligning brewing schedules with expected traffic, adjusting for season, weather, and local events that affect attendance. A quiet week leads to smaller batches or delayed tapping, while busy periods require advanced preparation to avoid running dry. Seasonal variation affects every part of this system. In warmer months, ale spoils faster, barrels must be turned over more quickly, and storage areas are chosen carefully to avoid heat. In colder months, fermentation slows, ale keeps slightly longer, and stronger batches may be produced to meet higher caloric needs. Taverns adapt without formal planning, adjusting batch size, strength, and serving pace based on conditions that are felt rather than calculated. Ale is also an economic anchor. Grain costs, labor for brewing, barrel maintenance, and losses from spoilage all factor into pricing, even if prices are not calculated formally. The tavern's survival depends on moving ale steadily without waste, because unsold drink represents lost grain, lost labor, and lost fuel. Unlike durable goods, ale cannot be stored indefinitely, so cash flow is tied directly to fermentation timing and consumption rate. By the time the evening is fully underway, the ale system is already in motion, governed by decisions made days earlier during brewing and hours earlier during tapping and placement. Every cup poured reflects a chain of constraints, from grain availability to barrel quality to ambient temperature. Understanding this system explains why ale dominates tavern life, not because it is preferred for its effects, but because it is the most reliable way to turn local resources into a consumable product that sustains both patrons and the tavern itself. Food in a medieval tavern is not organized around choice, preference, or variety, because those concepts require surplus, predictability, and fuel that most taverns do not have. Instead, food exists as a supporting process, designed to deliver calories efficiently, reuse heat already generated by the hearth, and avoid waste in a setting where ingredients spoil quickly and resupply is uncertain. What is served on any given evening is determined by what is already available, what can be kept warm without additional firing, and what can be portioned without slowing the flow of drink. The foundation of tavern food is pottage, a thick, slowly simmered mixture of grains, vegetables, and whatever protein or fat is available. Pottage is not a recipe in the modern sense, but an ongoing preparation that changes gradually over time. It may contain barley, oats, peas, onions, leeks, or cabbage, and occasionally small amounts of meat, bones, or fat, if available. The pot is kept near the hearth where heat is steady rather than intense, allowing it to remain hot without requiring constant attention. This placement is deliberate because bringing a cold pot to temperature later would require fuel that cannot be spared once the evening is underway. Bread accompanies nearly every serving of food, but it is not baked on demand. Bread arrives already made, baked earlier in communal ovens or by local bakers, and delivered in loaves meant to last several days. These loaves are dense, made from rye, barley, or mixed grains, and they stale quickly rather than spoil. Staleness is not a problem. Hard bread can be dipped into pottage, used as a trencher to hold food, or broken into pieces and softened with liquid. The bread's role is not flavor, but structure, providing bulk and calories with minimal preparation. Cheese and salted foods round out what is available, but they are served sparingly and only when supply allows. Cheese keeps longer than fresh dairy, but it is still a valuable product, often sourced locally and subject to seasonal variation. Salted meat or fish may be present, but these are not cooked fresh in the tavern during service. They are sliced, portioned, or added in small amounts to pottage, because prolonged cooking would require additional fuel and attention. Salt preservation extends shelf life, but does not eliminate spoilage, so these items are used carefully and rotated steadily. Reheating is managed through proximity to the hearth rather than direct cooking. Food is kept warm by resting pots and containers near embers, not by actively stoking flames. This allows heat already produced for light and warmth to serve multiple purposes. Fully reheating cold food would require a surge of fuel and disrupt the balance of the fire. So food that cannot be kept warm continuously is avoided during busy periods. Instead, the tavern relies on preparations that tolerate long holding times without degrading completely. Reuse is built into the system. Pottage from earlier in the day is not discarded if it remains safe, but thickened, adjusted, or combined with new ingredients. Bread that has grown too hard to eat on its own is repurposed as a thickener or soaked and served as part of a meal. Nothing is reset to zero at the start of the evening. Each serving reflects what came before it, shaped by gradual change rather than fresh preparation. This continuity reduces labor and limits waste, which is essential when resupply depends on local conditions rather than scheduled deliveries. Portioning is done without scales, measures, or written standards. The tavern keeper or server relies on habit and visual judgment, using the same ladles, knives, and hands each evening. Portions are sized to satisfy hunger without exhausting supply, and adjustments are made based on the number of people present and the pace of service. Larger portions early in the evening may be reduced later if demand increases, because running out entirely creates more disruption than serving slightly less. This flexibility allows the tavern to adapt in real time without formal calculation. Serving order follows practicality rather than fairness. Those who arrive earlier are more likely to receive fuller portions because food is hottest and supply is most certain at that point. Later arrivals may find fewer options or smaller servings, not as a punishment, but because fuel and ingredients are finite. Taverns do not promise equal access, only reasonable provision. Patrons understand this because the system is familiar and visible. No menu is needed to explain what will be served, because expectation is shaped by routine rather than choice. Scarcity management is constant but understated. The tavern must ensure that food lasts through the period when it is most needed, typically the early evening when people have just finished work and ale consumption is highest. Serving too much food early reduces the ability to offer anything later, while holding too much back risks spoilage. Decisions are adjusted quietly, with little explanation, because the logic is widely understood. Food is supplemental, meant to steady the body rather than dominate the experience. This is why food remains secondary to drink in the tavern. Ale can be produced in larger quantities, served more quickly, and consumed steadily without requiring additional fuel once the barrel is tapped. Food, by contrast, ties directly into fire management and labor. Every pot stirred and every portion served draws unlimited resources. Taverns, therefore, emphasize drink as the primary offering, with food supporting it by preventing hunger and moderating intoxication rather than replacing meals entirely. Calorie delivery under these constraints favors dense, familiar foods that can be held, reused, and served without interruption. Pottage provides warmth and energy, bread provides bulk, and small amounts of fat or protein improve satiety. Together, they sustain patrons through the evening without requiring the tavern to operate as a kitchen in the modern sense. The system is not designed for pleasure or choice, but for reliability, allowing the tavern to feed many people adequately while conserving fuel and labor. By the time the room fills and ale begins to flow steadily, food has already settled into its role. It remains present, warm, and available, but it does not dictate the pace of the evening. Instead, it supports it quietly, shaped by the same constraints that govern every other part of the tavern, delivering calories efficiently until the hearth cools, the pots are drawn back, and preparation begins for whatever the next day will require. Fire governs everything inside the tavern, but it does so quietly, through continuous adjustment rather than dramatic action, and much of the labor involved remains unnoticed, precisely because it must be constant to be effective. The hearth is already established before service begins, yet it never reaches a finished state. Instead, it is managed throughout the evening to maintain a narrow range of usefulness, hot enough to provide warmth, light, and cooking heat, but restrained enough to avoid wasting fuel or filling the room with smoke. This balance is not achieved once, but revisited repeatedly as conditions inside the space change. Hearth control begins with the size and placement of the fire itself. Large fires consume fuel rapidly and create uneven heat, leaving areas of the room overheated while others remain cold. Smaller, steadier fires are preferred, built with an understanding of how heat radiates across the room and how people will gather around it. Wood is added in measured amounts, often smaller pieces rather than full logs, because this allows more precise control over flame and heat output. The goal is not brightness or spectacle, but stability, a fire that can be maintained for hours without constant rebuilding. As the evening progresses and the number of people in the tavern increases, the fire must be adjusted to account for body heat and movement. A crowded room requires less fuel to remain warm, while a sparsely occupied space cools quickly once doors open and close. These changes are subtle but significant, and they are tracked instinctively by those responsible for the hearth. Adding fuel too aggressively early in the evening leads to overheating later, while neglecting the fire results in discomfort that drives people closer together and disrupts the layout of the room. Lighting is inseparable from fire management because every source of light consumes fuel and requires supervision. Taverns rely on a combination of hearth, light, candles, and rush lights, each chosen for specific purposes. The hearth provides the strongest light near its center, but its reach is limited and uneven. Candles offer steadier illumination but are expensive to make and must be conserved. Rush lights, made by soaking dried rushes in fat or grease, burn quickly and unevenly, but are cheap and easy to replace. Each type is used where its limitations are least disruptive. Candles are reserved for areas where steady light is necessary, such as the serving area, near the hearth where food is handled, or near the door where movement increases the risk of accidents. They are lit deliberately and extinguished as soon as they are no longer needed, because even a single candle represents a measurable cost in materials and labor. Rush lights fill in darker areas where brief illumination is sufficient, such as along walls or near benches, but they are allowed to burn out naturally rather than being replaced immediately. This creates uneven lighting by design, reflecting priorities rather than neglect. Smoke management is a constant concern, especially as the fire is adjusted and fuel changes. Different woods burn differently, producing varying amounts of smoke and ash, and damp fuel increases smoke output dramatically. Ventilation relies on chimney design, flues, and the careful use of shutters and doors to create enough draft to pull smoke upward without creating cold currents across the room. Poor smoke control irritates eyes and lungs, reduces visibility, and drives people away from certain areas, so adjustments are made as soon as problems appear. Opening a door briefly to admit new patrons can disrupt this balance, allowing smoke to billow back into the room or extinguishing smaller lights. For this reason, entry is managed carefully, with doors opened only as wide and as long as necessary. Shutters may be adjusted in response, not for light, but to restore airflow patterns that keep smoke moving upward. These corrections are subtle and often unnoticed by patrons, but they prevent conditions from degrading over time. Balancing warmth against fuel loss is an ongoing calculation that shapes the tavern's atmosphere more than any deliberate choice. Every opening in the building allows heat to escape, and every increase in fire intensity shortens the available fuel supply. Taverns are built to retain heat through thick walls and small openings, but these features also limit ventilation and light. The resulting dimness is not a stylistic preference, but a practical outcome of energy conservation. Bright spaces require large fires and many lights, neither of which can be sustained for long without exhausting resources. As the evening wears on, the fire is often allowed to settle lower, especially if cooking is complete and the room is full. Body heat compensates for reduced flame, and dimmer light discourages unnecessary movement. This gradual reduction extends fuel reserves and ensures that embers remain usable later when the room empties and closing tasks begin. Letting the fire burn too hot early leaves nothing but cold ash at the end of the night, forcing additional fuel use or leaving the space uncomfortable for final work. The dimness of the tavern also serves an organizational function. Lower light levels, slow activity, reduce visual distractions, and make prolonged sitting more comfortable. Patrons adjust naturally, staying closer to familiar areas and relying on memory rather than sight to navigate the space. This reduces collisions, spills, and unnecessary walking, all of which create additional work. In this way, limited lighting supports order without requiring enforcement. Every adjustment to fire and light is made in response to immediate conditions rather than a preset plan. There is no fixed schedule for adding fuel or lighting additional candles. Instead, decisions are guided by the feel of the room, the behavior of the fire, and the availability of resources. This flexibility allows the tavern to operate efficiently across different seasons, crowd sizes, and weather conditions without changing its basic structure. By the time the evening reaches its steady phase, fire and light have been tuned to a stable state, providing enough warmth and visibility for the room to function without excess. The work involved is largely invisible, because success is measured by the absence of problems rather than by visible effort. When the system works well, the fire does not draw attention to itself, the light does not demand adjustment, and the room remains usable for hours. This quiet management of energy is what allows the tavern to operate at all, conserving fuel, labor, and attention in a world where none of those resources can be wasted. Serving in a medieval tavern operates on the assumption that time is abundant, but resources are not. And this shapes every aspect of how drink is distributed, payments are handled, and movement through the space is managed. There is no expectation of rapid service, because speed requires surplus labor, surplus vessels, and written systems that most taverns do not possess. Instead, service proceeds at a pace that matches the constraints of the room, the availability of ale, and the capacity of the people working within it. This slowness is not accidental or inefficient. It is the default mode that allows the tavern to function for hours without exhausting its limited systems. Cups are reused constantly because producing large numbers of drinking vessels is costly and storage space is limited. Most taverns maintain a working stock of wooden, ceramic, or occasionally metal cups, enough to support steady turnover, but not enough to give every patron a dedicated vessel for the entire evening. After a cup is emptied, it is returned to the serving area, rinsed quickly in water that may be refreshed several times during the night, and put back into circulation. This rinse is functional rather than thorough, intended to remove visible residue rather than sanitize in a modern sense. The system relies on constant use rather than cleanliness as an abstract goal, and the mild alcohol content of ale further reduces immediate risk. Communal vessels are also common, especially among groups who arrive together. A single pitcher or jug may be shared at a table, with individuals pouring into their own cups or drinking in turn. This reduces the number of vessels in motion, limits spillage, and simplifies service. It also slows consumption naturally because access to the drink is mediated by the group rather than by the server. Taverns favor this arrangement not for social reasons, but because it reduces workload and conserves resources. Fewer vessels mean fewer items to rinse, fewer opportunities for breakage, and less movement across the floor. Orders are taken without writing, because writing materials are not always available. Literacy cannot be assumed, and the range of offerings is limited enough to be remembered. Most patrons do not request specific variations. They ask for ale, weak or strong, if that distinction is available, and occasionally for food if it is still being served. The tavern keeper or server listens, acknowledges, and moves on. There is no need to repeat or confirm orders because the system does not support customization. What is available is served in the order requested, and deviations are rare. Memory-based service relies on familiarity and repetition rather than mental strain. The same faces appear regularly, the same requests are made, and the same sequence of actions is followed each evening. Patrons understand that service will take time, and they adjust their expectations accordingly. Waiting is normal, not a sign of neglect. Because there is no pressure to serve quickly, mistakes are fewer, and the pace of work remains steady. This reduces stress on both staff and patrons, allowing the evening to unfold without escalation or frustration. Slowness is further reinforced by the physical layout of the space. Narrow serving areas, heavy barrels, and limited lighting discourage rapid movement. Carrying multiple full cups across a crowded floor increases the risk of spills, burns, or injury, so servers move carefully and deliberately. Each trip from barrel to table is planned to serve several needs at once, when possible, rather than responding immediately to each individual request. This batching of tasks is not formalized, but it emerges naturally from the constraints of the environment. Payment is handled with similar restraint. Coins are used, but not for every transaction, and not always immediately. Many patrons are known to the tavern keeper and settle accounts periodically rather than per cup. This credit system is informal but structured, based on reputation, regularity, and the understanding that continued access depends on eventual payment. Coins are stored in simple containers or pouches, not counted publicly or frequently, because visible handling of money can attract attention and disputes. For those paying per serving, the exchange is brief and uncomplicated. Prices are known in advance, either by custom or by posted notice if required by local regulation. There is little negotiation during service, because haggling slows the process and disrupts the flow of the room. Payment is made when convenient, not necessarily at the moment of service, and servers trust that patrons will settle before leaving. This trust is not naive. Those who fail to pay are remembered, and access can be denied in the future. Trust functions as a form of regulation, reducing the need for constant oversight. In small communities, reputation travels quickly, and taverns rely on this social mechanism to enforce behavior. Regular patrons benefit from flexibility, while strangers may be required to pay more promptly or in advance. These distinctions are made quietly, without announcement, and adjusted based on experience. The absence of formal contracts or written records does not mean the system is loose. It means enforcement is distributed across memory and community awareness. The slow pace of service also limits consumption naturally. Ale is not poured continuously, and refills require waiting, which spaces out drinking over time. This reduces intoxication, maintains order, and extends the supply. Taverns are not designed to encourage rapid drinking because disorder increases labor and risk. By serving slowly, the tavern protects itself without imposing explicit rules. Patrons who want to drink faster must do so within the constraints of the system, which rarely accommodates excess. As the evening progresses, the rhythm of service settles into a predictable pattern. Cups circulate, barrels are tapped or replaced as needed, and payments are noted mentally. There is no rush to clear tables or move people along, because turnover happens gradually as individuals finish drinking and leave. This steady flow allows the tavern to operate for hours without sudden spikes in activity. When demand decreases, service slows further, conserving resources and allowing the fire and lights to be reduced without disruption. The absence of speed does not indicate inefficiency. On the contrary, it reflects an optimization for endurance rather than throughput. The tavern is built to last through long evenings with minimal strain, not to maximize short-term output. Every aspect of service, from cup reuse to memory-based accounting, supports this goal. The system assumes patience on all sides, and in return, it delivers stability and predictability. By relying on low-speed service as the default, the tavern aligns its operations with the limits of its environment. Fuel, light, labor, and attention are conserved, and problems are resolved before they escalate. Serving without speed is not a deficiency to be corrected, but a deliberate adaptation to conditions where efficiency is measured in hours sustained rather than transactions completed. This rhythm carries the evening forward quietly, allowing the tavern to function as intended until the room empties and the next set of tasks begins. Social order inside a medieval tavern is maintained without spectacle, force, or constant intervention, because overt control consumes labor, attracts attention, and risks escalation that the space is not equipped to absorb. Taverns function best when behavior remains predictable, voices stay low enough to allow conversation without competition, and movement follows established paths. This stability is not achieved through fear or authority alone, but through routine, familiarity, and the quiet understanding that access to the space depends on cooperation rather than assertion. Tavern rules exist, but they are rarely written or displayed prominently. Instead, they are enforced through custom, local expectation, and the authority of the tavern keeper, who operates as both host and gatekeeper. These rules govern practical matters rather than morality. They address where people sit, how long they may remain, how disputes are handled, and when service may be refused. Because these expectations are consistent from evening to evening, most patrons adjust their behavior automatically without needing correction. Local authority supports this system indirectly. Taverns are licensed or tolerated by town officials, lords, or guilds, and the right to operate can be revoked if disorder becomes habitual. This external pressure encourages tavern keepers to maintain calm environments, not through constant policing, but by preventing problems from developing. A tavern known for violence or theft attracts scrutiny, fines, or closure, outcomes that threaten livelihood more than any single unruly patron. Disputes do occur, but they are usually addressed early and quietly. Raised voices draw attention immediately in a dim, enclosed space, and the tavern keeper or an experienced regular often intervenes before words harden into action. Intervention takes the form of redirection rather than confrontation. A disputing patron may be offered another cup, asked to change seats, or reminded of an obligation elsewhere. These gestures create pauses that allow tempers to cool without requiring anyone to lose face publicly. Seating arrangements play a central role in managing behavior. Benches along walls or near the hearth are typically occupied by regulars or those known to the tavern keeper, while newcomers or travelers are seated closer to entrances or edges of the room. This is not formal segregation, but a practical distribution of trust. Familiar patrons are less likely to cause disruption and more likely to help diffuse it. Placing them centrally stabilizes the space, while keeping unfamiliar individuals within easy view allows quicker response if needed. Hierarchy within the tavern reflects broader social structures without explicitly enforcing them. Wealthier patrons may sit closer to the hearth or at tables rather than benches, not because they are granted privilege by rule, but because they arrive earlier, stay longer, and can afford additional drink. Laborers and travelers accept peripheral seating because the arrangement is expected and temporary. This quiet sorting reduces competition for space and minimizes friction because positions are understood rather than negotiated. Violence is discouraged not only because it is dangerous, but because it is disruptive to every system the tavern depends on. A fight risks injury that halts service, spills that waste ale, broken furniture that requires repair, and attention from authorities that threatens future operation. Even minor altercations create ripples that consume labor and fuel. For these reasons, tavern keepers act quickly to prevent physical conflict, often refusing service to those who show early signs of agitation. Refusal of service is one of the most effective tools available, and it is applied sparingly. Denial of ale signals exclusion without confrontation. Because ale is central to the tavern's purpose, refusing it carries weight, especially in communities where alternative gathering spaces are limited. Patrons understand that continued access depends on acceptable behavior, and most adjust accordingly. Those who do not are remembered, and memory functions as enforcement across evenings rather than within a single night. The tavern keeper occupies a unique position in this system. They are not an enforcer in the modern sense, but a manager of balance, responsible for reading the room and adjusting conditions to prevent problems. This includes controlling the pace of service, limiting refills, altering seating, and adjusting light or heat to influence behavior indirectly. A cooler, dimmer room discourages movement and loud conversation, while steady service and familiarity encourage calm persistence rather than escalation. Regular patrons contribute to order through presence rather than action. Their familiarity with the space and its expectations provides a stabilizing effect, signaling acceptable behavior to newcomers without instruction. In many cases, a glance or brief comment from a respected regular is enough to end a developing dispute. This distributed responsibility reduces the burden on the tavern keeper and allows order to be maintained without constant oversight. Rules regarding weapons further support this stability. In many regions, patrons are expected to leave knives or tools sheathed, and larger weapons are discouraged or prohibited entirely. Enforcement relies on custom rather than search, because most people comply automatically in shared spaces. The visible absence of weapons lowers the perceived risk of violence and reinforces the expectation that the tavern is a place for rest rather than confrontation. Noise levels are managed implicitly. Excessive shouting draws attention and invites intervention, while quieter conversation blends into the background and goes unnoticed. The tavern does not aim for silence, but for a consistent ambient level that allows speech without competition. This balance reduces misunderstandings and prevents the buildup of tension that often precedes conflict. Over the course of the evening, this system of quiet control maintains itself through repetition. Patrons arrive, take expected seats, drink at a measured pace, and leave without ceremony. Problems are addressed early, often before they are fully formed, and those that cannot be resolved quietly are removed from the space before they escalate. There is no climax, no moment of enforcement, only continuous adjustment. Social stability in the tavern does not rely on strength, punishment, or constant authority. It emerges from shared routines, limited choices, and the understanding that the space functions only when everyone cooperates with its constraints. By maintaining order through familiarity and predictability, the tavern preserves its ability to operate night after night, providing drink, warmth, and rest without becoming a site of conflict. The atmosphere inside a medieval tavern is not created deliberately, but emerges from the interaction of work, materials, bodies, and time. Sound, smell, and silence are not layered for comfort or effect. They are byproducts of systems operating within narrow limits of fuel, space, and labor. Understanding this atmosphere requires treating it not as ambience, but as evidence of how the tavern functions moment by moment. Sound inside the tavern is uneven and episodic rather than constant. There is no sustained background noise in the modern sense, because no device produces it and no labor is assigned to maintain it. Instead, sound rises and falls according to activity. Boots scrape on packed earth floors as patrons enter or shift benches. Wooden cups touch tables with dull taps. Lids are lifted from barrels, then set back into place. These sounds occur briefly, then disappear, leaving stretches of relative quiet between them. Conversation itself follows a similar pattern. Speech is not continuous across the room. Small clusters speak quietly among themselves, often leaning close to be heard without raising voices. When someone laughs or speaks loudly, it briefly fills the space, then fades as others continue their conversations unaffected. There is no expectation that sound must be constant to signal liveliness. Silence is normal and unremarkable, because the tavern is not a stage and its patrons are not performers. The absence of continuous noise serves a practical purpose. Sustained loudness requires energy, attention, and alcohol in excess, all of which are limited. Patrons conserving drink and stamina naturally speak less. Tavern keepers discourage shouting indirectly, because raised voices often precede disorder. A quieter room allows early detection of problems and reduces the likelihood of escalation. Silence, in this context, is not emptiness, but stability. Music, when present, is occasional and conditional. It is not a default feature of the tavern. Instruments require players, and players require incentive. Music appears when a traveling musician seeks food or drink in exchange for performance, or when a local patron brings a familiar instrument during a festive evening. Even then, music is short-lived. Songs are played in bursts, not continuously, because both musicians and listeners tire quickly, and the space does not support prolonged performance without distraction or conflict. Most evenings pass without music at all. This absence is not experienced as lack, because the tavern's primary function is rest and social exchange, not entertainment. When music does occur, it temporarily alters the room's rhythm, drawing attention inward, then dissolves back into quiet conversation once it ends. Silence returns without disappointment, because it is expected. Smell within the tavern operates under similar constraints. Odors are not masked or eliminated. They are managed indirectly through routine and material choice. The dominant smells are ale, smoke, damp wood, wool clothing, and human presence. These odors mix gradually rather than sharply, because nothing in the tavern produces sudden, overwhelming scent unless something goes wrong. Smoke is the most persistent element. Even with careful hearth management, smoke lingers in the air, especially near the ceiling. Ventilation relies on open shutters, doors, and roof gaps rather than chimneys in many taverns, meaning smoke disperses slowly rather than disappearing. Patrons grow accustomed to it, and its presence becomes part of the tavern's normal state rather than a discomfort to be corrected. Food smells are muted rather than rich. Pottage and bread produce mild, familiar scents that blend into the background rather than dominating it. Strong aromas are rare because spices are scarce and cooking is restrained. When cheese, salted meat, or onions are present, their smells emerge briefly during serving, then fade as dishes are removed or covered. The tavern does not smell of abundance, but of continuity. Human odors are unavoidable, but they are mitigated through spacing and airflow rather than cleanliness in the modern sense. Benches are arranged to prevent overcrowding, and doors are opened periodically to allow air exchange, especially during busy moments. This is not done for comfort alone, but to prevent the buildup of stale air that makes long evenings unbearable. Silence often follows periods of activity. After a wave of arrivals, the room settles. After a song ends, voices lower. After serving, the tavern keeper pauses. These quiet intervals are not pauses in operation, but signs that systems are functioning efficiently without strain. Silence allows the tavern to reset without conscious effort, conserving energy and attention for when they are needed again. The tavern's atmosphere also reflects time of day. Early evening carries more movement and conversation as patrons arrive from work. Later hours grow quieter, not because rules demand it, but because fatigue accumulates. Speech slows, benches empty, and sounds become more isolated. The tavern does not maintain intensity, it gradually releases it. Importantly, none of these sensory conditions are designed with intention beyond practicality. There is no effort to create mood. The atmosphere emerges from limitations: limited light, limited fuel, limited drink, limited energy. What modern observers might describe as calming or immersive is, in reality, the natural result of systems operating within strict boundaries. Understanding this reveals an essential principle. The tavern does not attempt to control sensory experience directly. Instead, it controls processes, and sensory outcomes follow. When service is slow, noise remains low. When fuel is conserved, light stays dim. When drink is rationed, voices soften. Atmosphere is not crafted, it is permitted. By the end of the evening, the tavern's soundscape thins further. Individual movements stand out. A single footstep, a cup placed on wood, a door closing softly. Smells settle into familiar layers rather than changing. The room holds its state without intervention, ready to be emptied, cleaned, and restored the next day. This is the lesson carried by sound, smell, and silence together. They are not features added to the tavern. They are evidence that the tavern systems are balanced, restrained, and functioning as intended, producing an environment that sustains itself quietly without effort or excess. Cleanliness in a medieval tavern is not defined by absence, but by control. Dirt, liquid, food scraps, ash, and refuse are expected to appear throughout the evening, and the work of the tavern is not to prevent them entirely, but to keep them from accumulating in ways that threaten health, order, or continued operation. Cleanliness is therefore procedural rather than cosmetic, shaped by habit, material availability, and time constraints rather than ideals. Spills occur constantly. Ale sloshes from communal cups, drips from poorly seated taps, and is knocked loose when benches shift or elbows collide. These spills are not treated as emergencies. They are anticipated. The floor, whether packed earth, clay, or rough boards, is prepared in advance to receive them. Rushes and straw are spread deliberately, not as decoration, but as absorbent layers that protect the surface beneath and reduce slipperiness. Rushes serve multiple functions at once. They soak up liquid, soften footing, insulate against cold rising from the ground, and trap debris that would otherwise be tracked throughout the space. When ale spills, It is absorbed gradually rather than spreading outward, limiting the affected area. Patrons step over darker patches without comment. The tavern keeper watches for saturation, not stains. When rushes become too wet or fouled, they are not immediately replaced. Removal is timed. Pulling them too early wastes material and labor. Leaving them too long risks odor and pests. The keeper uses sight, smell, and touch to judge the moment when replacement is necessary. Small sections may be lifted and refreshed during quieter moments, while full replacement waits until closing. Food scraps follow a similar logic. Bits of bread crust, cheese rind, or vegetable peel fall to the floor during serving. These are not swept constantly, because doing so would interrupt service and draw attention to disorder. Instead, scraps are allowed to collect within the rushes, where they are partially concealed and later removed in bulk. This reduces repeated labor and keeps the visible space orderly enough to function. Waste disposal is structured around containment rather than removal. Inside the tavern, refuse is kept in designated corners or vessels, often simple baskets or wooden tubs. These containers hold bones, rinds, and unusable scraps until the end of the evening. Liquids unsuitable for consumption, such as spoiled ale or dregs, are poured into specific areas outside the main footpath, not scattered randomly. Nightly cleaning begins not with washing, but with clearing. Benches are lifted or tilted to expose the floor beneath. Tables are scraped, not scrubbed, using blunt tools that remove residue without damaging the wood. Cups are gathered and stacked for washing elsewhere, not cleaned in the main room. The goal is to reset the space to a usable baseline, not to remove every trace of use. Floor cleaning involves gathering the rushes and straw into bundles. These are carried outside and either composted, burned, or discarded depending on condition. Fresh rushes are not laid immediately unless the tavern opens early the next day. Often, the bare floor is left overnight to dry, reducing dampness and odor before being covered again. Water use is limited and deliberate. Washing floors with water is avoided unless absolutely necessary, because it creates mud, prolongs drying, and encourages mold. Instead, dry cleaning methods dominate. Ash from the hearth may be sprinkled lightly to absorb moisture and neutralize odor before being swept away. Sand is sometimes used in a similar manner. Pest control is constant but understated. Mice, insects, and other small intruders are expected in any space where food and warmth coexist. The tavern's defense lies in denial of access and attraction rather than extermination. Food is kept elevated or sealed. Spills are absorbed quickly. Waste is removed nightly. Cats are common, not as pets, but as working animals whose presence discourages rodents without effort. Insects are managed indirectly. Smoke from the hearth deters some pests. Airflow through open doors and shutters disrupts others. Rushes, when replaced regularly, prevent larvae from establishing. There is no attempt to eliminate insects entirely, because doing so would require resources unavailable. The goal is reduction to tolerable levels. Odor management follows the same principle. Strong smells signal failure of routine, not moral deficiency. If the tavern smells sharply sour, rotten, or stagnant, it indicates that waste removal has lagged or ventilation has been insufficient. Mild, familiar smells are acceptable. The keeper aims for clean enough, meaning nothing draws attention or causes patrons to leave early. This standard of cleanliness reflects practical priorities. Labor is finite. Water must be carried. fuel must be conserved. Time spent chasing perfection is time not spent serving, guarding stock, or resting. Cleanliness, therefore, exists to support continuity, not comfort. It ensures the tavern can open again tomorrow without repair or illness. Importantly, this system relies on routine rather than inspection. There is no checklist. The keeper's body learns the sequence: clear, scrape, lift, sweep, replace. These actions occur in the same order each night, reducing decision-making and error. Over time, the process becomes automatic, requiring little conscious thought. The tavern's cleanliness is thus invisible when it works. Patrons do not comment on it. They notice only when it fails. A sticky floor, a sharp odor, an infestation. Success is measured by absence of complaint, not by shine. This aligns with the broader medieval approach to sanitation, where function defines adequacy. By morning, the space stands reset. The floor is dry. Waste is gone. Tools are in place. The tavern does not look unused, but it looks ready. This readiness, achieved without modern tools or concepts of hygiene, allows the tavern to persist day after day, sustained by routines that balance effort against necessity with quiet efficiency. The economic life of a medieval tavern operates without ledgers, receipts, or fixed prices written for all to see, yet it functions with remarkable consistency. This is not because money is unimportant, but because money is handled through systems adapted to scarcity, irregular supply, and the limits of trust within a small community. Coins circulate, credit accumulates, and memory performs much of the work that paper and ink would later assume. Coins enter the tavern unevenly. Some patrons arrive with a few small denominations earned that day, others with none at all. Silver pennies, half-pennies, farthings, and occasionally foreign coins appear across the table, their value understood by weight and familiarity rather than by inscription alone. Gold is rare and often unwelcome, because making change requires coin the tavern keeper may not have. As a result, transactions favor small amounts paid repeatedly rather than large sums settled at once. Many evenings pass with little coin exchanged at all. Credit is not an exception. It is a structural feature. Regular patrons are served without immediate payment, their consumption noted mentally or marked indirectly. This practice is not casual generosity, but a calculated response to reality. Refusing service to someone temporarily without coin risks, losing a long-term customer whose future payments sustain the tavern. Trust underpins this system, but it is not blind. Credit is extended selectively, based on reputation built over time. A patron known to work regularly, remain orderly, and settle debts eventually is granted leeway. A stranger receives less. The tavern keeper constantly evaluates behavior, not through formal rules, but through accumulated observation. Tally sticks provide a physical aid where memory alone becomes strained. These are simple wooden sticks notched to represent amounts owed. One half is kept by the tavern keeper, the matching half by the patron, ensuring that neither party can alter the record without detection. The marks are crude but effective, encoding quantity rather than currency type. Payment later reconciles the marks, not the individual drinks consumed. Even without tally sticks, memory accounting dominates. The keeper remembers who drinks regularly, who pays weekly, who settles monthly, and who must be reminded. This memory is not perfect, but perfection is unnecessary. Minor discrepancies balance out over time, especially when most patrons return repeatedly. The system relies on averages rather than precision. Regular patrons are the economic backbone of the tavern. They provide predictability in an environment where supply and demand fluctuate constantly. A familiar group returning each evening allows the keeper to plan ale rotation, fuel use, and staffing with confidence. These patrons are not merely customers. They are stabilizing elements within the tavern's economy. Because of this reliance, the tavern keeper tolerates small losses. A forgotten payment, a spilled drink, or an unpaid cup is absorbed as part of operating cost. Attempting to recover every fraction of value would damage relationships and slow service. Survival depends on continuity, not optimization. Pricing itself is flexible. While authorities may set maximum prices for ale or bread, enforcement is uneven, and actual charges adjust subtly based on availability and patronage. During shortages, portions shrink rather than prices rising openly. During abundance, generosity increases to encourage consumption before spoilage. The tavern's financial health depends on flow, not margins. Coins received are stored carefully but simply. A locked chest or concealed container holds daily takings, separated from household funds when possible. Yet even here, money is not left idle. Coin is used quickly to secure fuel, ingredients, or repairs. Hoarding serves little purpose when tomorrow's needs are immediate. Credit relationships extend beyond patrons. Suppliers, brewers, and fuel sellers often operate on similar trust-based terms. A barrel may be delivered with payment deferred until ale is sold. Firewood may be settled after harvest. These interlocking obligations create a web of mutual dependence that sustains the local economy. Disputes over money are handled quietly. Public arguments threaten the atmosphere and the trust that underpins credit. The keeper addresses discrepancies privately, often allowing time to resolve them without confrontation. Persistent failure to pay results not in violence, but in reduced service or exclusion. Economic discipline is enforced through access, not force. The absence of formal records does not mean chaos. Instead, repetition replaces documentation. Each evening resembles the last closely enough that deviations stand out. When someone drinks more than usual, delays payment longer than expected, or fails to appear altogether, the change is noticed immediately. Memory is sharpened by routine. Over weeks and years, this system proves resilient. Patrons age, fortunes shift, and coins change hands. Yet the tavern endures because its economy is not built on isolated transactions. It is built on ongoing relationships, repeated exchanges, and shared understanding of obligation. This is why taverns survive where other ventures fail. They do not depend on novelty or growth, but on steady return. Each cup served strengthens a relationship that supports the next evening. Money flows slowly, unevenly, but reliably enough to sustain the space. In this system, record keeping is distributed across people rather than stored in books. Trust substitutes for contracts, memory substitutes for ledgers, and repetition substitutes for enforcement. The tavern's economy functions because it mirrors the rhythms of the community it serves, adapting to human limits rather than resisting them. By the end of the night, coins are counted roughly, tallies noted, and debts left unresolved but remembered. Nothing is closed conclusively. The system remains open, extending forward into the next evening, where the same patterns will resume, carrying the tavern quietly through time. Closing the tavern is not a sudden event marked by an announcement or command. but a gradual narrowing of activity that unfolds over time, guided by habit rather than instruction. There is no bell to signal the end of service, no fixed hour that applies universally. Instead, closing begins when momentum fades, when voices soften, when cups are no longer refilled automatically, and when the work of maintaining the space quietly overtakes the work of serving it. The first sign of closing is dispersal, and dispersal happens unevenly. Some patrons leave early, gathering cloaks and tools as soon as their conversation ends or fatigue sets in. Others remain longer, finishing what they have already been served without asking for more. The tavern keeper does not hurry them, but does not encourage extension either. Service slows naturally as attention shifts elsewhere. Refills become less frequent, not because ale has run out, but because pouring more would require reopening barrels, lifting lids, or disturbing settled sediment. The keeper begins to favor completion over continuation. Cups already filled are allowed to empty. Empty vessels are collected quietly and stacked near the hearth or door. This small change communicates the approaching end without words. As patrons depart, benches lighten and tables clear. The room becomes patchy, occupied in clusters rather than fully. Sound thins accordingly. Footsteps toward the door are more common than footsteps entering. The tavern keeper watches this transition closely, because it determines how much labor remains before rest is possible. Attention then turns toward the fire, which must be reduced carefully rather than extinguished abruptly. The hearth is the most dangerous element in the room after hours, and its management defines the safety of the night. Larger pieces of fuel are not added once closing begins. Instead, the keeper allows existing wood to burn down, spreading embers slightly to hasten their decay while avoiding sudden flare-ups. Ash management is deliberate. Ash is not left piled thickly against glowing coals, because trapped heat can persist unnoticed. Using a shovel or rake, the keeper pulls ash forward, thinning it to expose embers so they cool more quickly. Some ash is removed entirely and placed in a metal or ceramic container kept away from flammable material. This container may remain outside overnight. The goal is not darkness, but stability. A small bed of embers may be left intentionally, sufficient to rekindle the fire in the morning without the labor of full relighting, but only if the hearth structure allows it safely. Where this is not possible, the fire is reduced further, and the space is allowed to cool completely. Doors are locked late in the process, not early. Locking too soon risks trapping remaining patrons or requiring reopening. The keeper waits until the room is nearly empty, then secures the main door using bar, latch, or bolt, depending on construction. Shutters are closed where necessary, not to seal the room entirely, but to reduce drafts and discourage intrusion. Remaining ale is addressed next. Open barrels are checked for level and condition. If a barrel is nearly empty, it may be drained fully to prevent spoilage or contamination overnight. If still viable, it is sealed carefully, with the tap removed or tightened to prevent leaks. The keeper notes which barrels will be served first the next day, mentally rotating stock based on age and exposure. This storage process is quiet and efficient. There is no recounting of inventory in detail. The keeper knows roughly what remains, because the flow of the evening has already been observed. Precision is unnecessary. The system relies on familiarity rather than measurement. Resetting the space begins before the last patron leaves. Benches are nudged back into alignment. Tables are cleared of cups and scraps. Spills left in the rushes are noted but not addressed fully until the room empties. The keeper sequences tasks carefully to avoid wasted movement. Each action prepares for the next. Once the room is empty, the pace slows further. This is not recovery time yet, but transition. The keeper surveys the space, identifying what must be done now and what can wait until morning. Floors may be swept lightly to gather loose debris. Rushes heavily soaked are removed, while others are left in place if still serviceable. Cleaning at closing is functional, not thorough. The objective is to prevent deterioration overnight, not to restore the tavern to unused condition. Food scraps are removed to reduce pests. Cups are stacked for washing later. Waste is taken outside or secured. Nothing decorative is adjusted, because nothing decorative exists. The tavern keeper's body guides much of this process without conscious planning. Movements follow patterns repeated hundreds of times. Hands reach for tools in the same order. Tasks are completed in the same sequence. This reduces error at the end of a long day when fatigue is highest. Sound during closing is minimal. Tools scrape softly. Wood shifts. The door closes with a dull thud. The tavern settles into a quieter state that feels distinct from both operation and rest. This is not an ending, but a pause. The final act is not ceremonial. There is no reflection on the day's success or failure. The keeper confirms that fire risk is controlled, stock is secure, and the space will hold until morning. Only then does personal rest begin, often in the same building or nearby, maintaining proximity to the tavern in case of disturbance. This closing process teaches an essential system. End-of-day preparation is not about completion, but continuity. The tavern is not shut down. It is stabilized. Everything left undone is left intentionally, because doing it now would cost more energy than it saves. By closing in this manner, the tavern preserves itself. It avoids damage, loss, and exhaustion. The space remains ready to reopen with minimal effort, sustaining a rhythm that allows the tavern to operate day after day without interruption or collapse. The night does not end with silence, but with readiness. The systems slow, align, and hold. And in that held state, the tavern waits, unchanged, for the next evening to begin. After the doors are locked and the last footsteps fade from the threshold, the tavern does not become inactive. It enters a different phase of operation, one defined by reduced movement rather than absence, and by vigilance rather than service. The systems that sustained the evening do not stop. They contract, settling into a state meant to carry the space safely through the night and into the next day. Sleeping arrangements within or near the tavern are shaped by proximity to responsibility. In many cases, the tavern keeper sleeps in an adjoining room, an upper loft, or partitioned space within the same structure. This is not a matter of convenience alone, but of control. Being close allows immediate response to sound, smoke, or intrusion without the delay of travel. The keeper does not fully withdraw from the tavern. They remain part of it, even in rest. Beds are simple and positioned strategically. Sleeping areas are chosen with awareness of the hearth, the door, and stored stock. The keeper's body learns to rest lightly, attuned to changes in sound or smell. Deep, uninterrupted sleep is rare on nights when fire remains warm or barrels are full. Rest is partial, structured around readiness rather than escape. Guarding stock overnight is mostly passive, relying on barriers and habit rather than constant watch. Barrels are stored low and heavy, difficult to move quietly. Chests are locked not to resist force indefinitely, but to delay it long enough to be noticed. Doors and shutters are secured in ways that create noise if disturbed. The tavern is designed to announce intrusion rather than prevent it entirely. Animals play a role here as well. Cats move freely through the space, their presence discouraging rodents and alerting the keeper to unusual activity. Dogs, when present, sleep near entrances, responding instinctively to unfamiliar movement. These animals require no instruction and no payment beyond food and shelter, making them ideal components of the tavern's overnight system. Night sounds fill the tavern differently than daytime noise. Without voices and footsteps, smaller sounds become distinct. Wood contracts as the air cools, producing soft creaks. Embers shift in the hearth. Wind presses against shutters. These sounds are familiar, forming a baseline that allows irregular noises to stand out. A scrape, a knock, or an unfamiliar rustle breaks the pattern immediately. The keeper learns these sounds over years. What is normal and what is not becomes instinctive. This auditory familiarity reduces anxiety and allows partial rest because the mind does not need to interpret every noise consciously. Only deviation demands attention. Fire safety remains the central concern throughout the night. If embers have been left intentionally, their behavior must be predictable. Hearth construction, ash placement, and airflow determine whether heat diminishes safely or persists dangerously. The keeper may wake once or twice to check the hearth, feeling for heat, smelling for smoke, and confirming that nothing has shifted. These checks are brief and practiced. In colder months, the temptation to leave more fire is weighed carefully against risk. A warmer room improves sleep but increases danger. The keeper balances this trade-off based on experience, weather, and the condition of the hearth. Overconfidence here is costly. Most fires that destroy taverns begin after hours, when attention lapses and systems are assumed to hold without confirmation. Ale and food stored overnight continue to change. Fermentation does not pause, and spoilage does not wait. Temperature shifts affect barrels, altering pressure and flavor. The keeper accounts for this unconsciously, planning morning service with the night's conditions in mind. A colder night may preserve ale slightly longer. A warm one accelerates decay. These variables are absorbed into routine without calculation. Readiness for morning begins during the night itself. Tools left in specific places allow immediate use upon waking. The hearth, if banked correctly, can be revived quickly. Doors and shutters are positioned to open without obstruction. Nothing is left in a state that would require problem-solving before the day begins. This readiness is crucial because morning does not arrive gently. Deliveries, early travelers, and laborers appear without warning. The tavern must transition from stillness to function efficiently. Any failure during the night multiplies effort in the morning, disrupting the rhythm that sustains the establishment. The tavern after hours exists in a suspended state, neither active nor dormant. It holds resources, risks, and responsibilities simultaneously. The keeper's presence, even in sleep, anchors this state, ensuring continuity across the invisible boundary between days. Nothing dramatic occurs during most nights, and that is the measure of success. Silence remains intact, stock remains secure, fire remains controlled. The tavern survives another cycle without incident. This quiet continuation teaches the final lesson of the evening. A tavern does not persist through moments of activity alone, but through the careful management of inactivity. By maintaining systems even when no one is watching, the tavern carries itself forward, unchanged, into the next day, ready to repeat the same patterns once more. Brewing days are not simply busier versions of ordinary tavern days. They are structurally different, layered on top of the normal rhythm rather than fitting neatly within it. On these days, the tavern shifts from being primarily a place of distribution to a place of production, and that shift alters nearly every system, from timekeeping and labor allocation to fuel use, water hauling, and even customer expectations. The most important difference is timing. Brewing cannot begin at the same hour as normal service preparation. It starts earlier, often well before dawn, because the process depends on heat cycles that must be completed before the day's warmth rises or before regular service demands attention. The keeper, or brewer, wakes while the surrounding town is still dark, not because it is ideal, but because delaying would compress too many tasks into too few hours later on. Fuel preparation begins first. Brewing requires sustained heat rather than short bursts, and that changes how firewood is selected and arranged. Larger, slower burning pieces are favored over kindling heavy loads. The hearth, or brewing fire, is built deliberately to hold temperature across long stretches without constant adjustment. This consumes more fuel than a serving day, and that extra cost is accounted for in advance. Brewing days are planned around fuel availability, not convenience. Water requirements increase dramatically. Ale is mostly water, and brewing demands clean, usable quantities, not just for the mash, but for cleaning vessels, cooling, and transfer. This means multiple trips to the well or stream, often completed before sunrise to avoid crowding or delay. Buckets are filled, staged, and rationed carefully. Water spilled during brewing is water lost, and lost water means more labor. The mash itself occupies the center of the day. Grain is mixed with hot water in large vessels, stirred to distribute heat evenly, and held within a narrow temperature range using judgment rather than measurement. Too hot, and the sugars fail to convert properly. Too cool, and fermentation suffers later. This stage demands attention that cannot be divided easily. During these hours, the tavern keeper is less available for service, which is why brewing days rarely coincide with heavy patron traffic. Because of this, brewing days disrupt normal routines. Benches may remain stacked longer, doors may open later, service may be limited or delayed. Regular patrons recognize these signs and adjust without complaint, understanding that today's inconvenience supports tomorrow's ale. The tavern relies on this shared understanding to function without explanation. Boiling follows mashing, and this stage further increases fuel consumption. The wort must be brought to a sustained boil, not briefly, but long enough to stabilize it for fermentation. This heat cannot be rushed. Attempts to shorten boiling risk spoilage later, which would waste far more resources than the extra fuel consumed now. Brewing days are therefore front-loaded with effort to protect future supply. While the boil continues, other tavern systems pause or slow. Cleaning is minimal. Food preparation is simplified. The keeper prioritizes the brew, because once fermentation fails, it cannot be repaired. Service can be adjusted. Ale cannot. Cooling introduces another timing constraint. Hot liquid must be cooled before yeast is added, but cooling depends on ambient conditions. In warm weather, this stage takes longer and carries higher risk. In colder months, it proceeds faster but introduces other challenges, such as contamination from airborne debris or rapid temperature drops. Brewing schedules shift seasonally to account for these factors, often favoring certain months for larger batches. Fermentation itself removes the tavern from active control. Once yeast is pitched and vessels are sealed, time takes over. For days afterward, the brew must be left undisturbed, occupying barrels or vats that cannot be used for serving. This creates temporary scarcity. The tavern may rely on older stock, ration portions, or reduce hours until new ale becomes ready. This is why brewing days are planned well in advance. The keeper tracks remaining barrels mentally, aligning brewing cycles so that new ale becomes drinkable as older batches near depletion. Errors here create gaps that cannot be filled quickly. Brewing too late risks running dry. Brewing too early risks spoilage or waste. The balance is learned through experience rather than calculation. On brewing days, labor intensity peaks, but visible activity may actually appear lower to patrons. Much of the work happens behind the hearth or in storage areas, out of sight. From the outside, the tavern seems quieter, slower, perhaps even closed. Internally, however, effort is concentrated and continuous. Brewing also reshapes risk. Large quantities of hot liquid, wet floors, and sustained fire increase danger. The keeper moves more cautiously, avoids distractions, and limits unnecessary movement through the space. Children and animals are kept away from the brewing area. These precautions are habitual, shaped by memory of past accidents rather than formal rules. Once the brewing day ends, exhaustion is deeper than on serving days. The labor is heavier, longer, and less social. There is little interaction to break the monotony. Yet the reward is deferred, not immediate. The keeper finishes the day knowing that the real value of the work will only appear later, poured one cup at a time. In the days following, the tavern returns to its normal rhythm, but with altered priorities. Fermenting ale is checked quietly. Barrels are listened to, smelled, and observed for signs of trouble. Service adjusts around these checks without announcement. Patrons may notice differences in taste or strength, but accept them as part of the cycle. This layering of production over service is what allows the tavern to exist at all. Without brewing days, there is no ale. Without serving days, there is no income. The two modes cannot merge fully, so they alternate, overlapping only where necessary. The system taught here is not efficiency, but endurance. Brewing days consume more resources up front to stabilize future operations. Serving days distribute those resources slowly, converting labor into sustenance and coin. The tavern survives by respecting this separation, allowing each type of day to dominate when it must, without forcing uniformity. In this way, time itself becomes an ingredient. Fermentation stretches effort across days and weeks, binding the tavern's present to its future. Brewing days remind us that what appears effortless at the table is supported by invisible labor performed long before the door opens, in the quiet hours when fire, water, grain, and patience come together to sustain the system. Over time, the life of a medieval tavern does not register as a series of distinct days with clear beginnings and endings, but as a continuous sequence of actions that repeat so consistently that individual moments dissolve into one another. The keeper does not wake each morning thinking of yesterday as a completed chapter, nor of today as something new to be shaped. Instead, the day begins already in motion, because the systems that define it never truly stopped. Days blur together because the tavern is not organized around events. There is no single task that marks a day as successful, beyond the tavern having opened, functioned, and closed without disruption. When this happens, the day leaves little impression. Memory records exceptions, not normality. A spilled barrel, a broken bench, a fight that required outside authority, a batch of ale that soured too early. Ordinary days are not remembered because remembering them provides no advantage. This gradual blurring is not accidental. It is a direct result of repetition reducing cognitive load. When tasks are performed the same way each day, the mind no longer needs to hold them actively. The body performs them instead. The keeper does not recall each instance of lighting the hearth, because the hands already know how much kindling to place, how to angle the wood, how to judge the draw of air. Conscious thought is reserved for irregularities, while routine absorbs the rest. As weeks pass, routines begin to replace memory entirely. The keeper no longer recalls learning these processes. They exist as physical habits rather than remembered instructions. This allows work to continue even under fatigue, illness, or distraction. The tavern does not rely on alertness to function. It relies on ingrained sequence. This is critical for survival over long spans. A system that requires constant attention eventually fails, because attention cannot be sustained indefinitely. By contrast, a system that embeds knowledge into habit can persist, even as individuals age, tire, or change. The tavern's endurance is therefore not a product of strength, but of reduced demand on the human mind. Across weeks, subtle patterns emerge that guide preparation without being formally acknowledged. Certain evenings draw more people, often linked to market days, wage payments, or religious calendars. The keeper does not calculate this in advance. They feel it in the way benches fill earlier, in the speed at which ale moves from barrel to cup. Preparation adjusts quietly. More fuel is laid out. Extra water is hauled earlier in the day. These adjustments occur without conscious planning because they have occurred before. Quiet days are treated with equal acceptance. A slow evening is not considered failure. It consumes fewer resources and allows recovery. Ale lasts longer. Firewood is spared. The tavern does not require constant fullness to justify its existence. It requires continuity. Over months, seasonal changes assert themselves, but they do so gradually enough that they rarely feel dramatic from within the tavern. Winter does not arrive suddenly. It advances in degrees. The hearth is lit earlier in the afternoon. Doors remain closed longer. Breath becomes visible indoors before anyone remarks on the cold. These shifts are absorbed into routine without announcement. In summer, the opposite occurs. Fire is minimized. Shutters are opened earlier and left open longer. The keeper learns to work around heat rather than against it, adjusting brewing schedules, food preparation, and storage accordingly. These changes do not require new systems. They are variations of the same ones, stretched or compressed by temperature and light. Food follows the same seasonal logic. Ingredients appear and disappear without ceremony. Certain vegetables become common, then scarce. Cheese hardens as it ages. Salted stores are drawn down, then replenished. The tavern does not mark these transitions as milestones. It adapts because adaptation has already been practiced many times before. Brewing cycles align naturally with this seasonal rhythm. Cooler months favor larger, more stable batches. Warmer periods demand caution, smaller volumes, and faster turnover. These decisions are not debated each year. They are inherited patterns. reinforced by memory of what went wrong in the past. Survival selects methods more reliably than instruction. Over years, the tavern begins to feel unchanged, even as its components are gradually replaced. Benches are repaired, then rebuilt. Roof timbers are reinforced. Barrels are swapped out. Cups crack and are replaced. None of this alters the way the tavern functions. Repair restores the system to its familiar state rather than transforming it. This continuity allows the tavern to outlive individual keepers. When ownership passes on, the space itself instructs the new keeper. The hearth demands certain care. The floor responds best to certain coverings. The barrels dictate timing and rotation. The building enforces behavior. A newcomer who ignores these cues struggles until they conform. Because of this, taverns often appear unchanged across generations. The same layout persists not because innovation is rejected, but because deviation introduces risk. A system that has survived decades is trusted more than an improvement that has not yet been tested by time. Stability becomes a form of wisdom. Social patterns mirror this physical continuity. Patrons behave predictably because predictability benefits everyone. Seating habits persist. Payment customs remain consistent. Disputes are resolved using familiar methods. These behaviors do not require enforcement because repetition has normalized them. Memory shifts from individual experience to collective rhythm. No one remembers the details of a specific ordinary evening from years ago, but everyone remembers how evenings usually unfold. This shared expectation reduces friction and anxiety. People know what is acceptable without being told. From the outside, this repetition can look static, even lifeless. From within, it provides security. The tavern offers reliability in a world marked by uncertainty. Travelers know what they will find. Locals know where to go. The tavern does not surprise them, and that is its value. The tavern's unchanged appearance over time is not proof of stagnation. It is evidence of refinement. Each repeated action has been tested repeatedly against reality. What remains is what worked. Everything else has already been discarded. Over long spans, the tavern becomes less an enterprise and more a fixture. It occupies the same place near the road or gate. It serves the same function year after year. People orient themselves around it without conscious thought. It becomes part of how the town understands itself. This endurance is not achieved through constant adaptation, but through selective resistance to change. The tavern filters variation, admitting only what does not threaten continuity. This conservatism is not ideological. It is practical. As weeks become years and years pass quietly, the tavern teaches its final lesson. Stability does not require innovation. It requires rhythm. When actions repeat reliably, memory can rest. When systems hold, individuals are freed from constant decision-making. There is no true ending to this process. The last evening resembles the first. The doors open, the fire is set, ale is served, the space is reset. The tavern continues, not by moving forward, but by remaining where it is, performing the same work well enough to be done again, and again, and again.